In today's video, we will look at the finances of Henry IV. The aims of this video are threefold. Firstly, we need to know where a medieval king gets his income from. Secondly, we need to explain how and why Henry's finances differed from his predecessors, particularly Richard II. And finally, we'll begin to see whether or not Henry could be blamed for the financial mismanagement that took place within his reign. So firstly, where would a medieval king get their money from? Firstly, a king would gain most of his revenue from customs. This would be the level of income from duties or tax paid on commodities that were being imported into the country at the time. In the medieval period, this was most commonly wool or cloth. Now, customs revenue would therefore depend on the volume of trade coming into the country and the actions of privateers or pirates as they were later known. In addition, a king would claim income from the lands that he owned. They might be rented or farmed or owned by somebody within the royal household, and therefore he would gain a substantial amount of money from these particular estates. And finally, a king would gain extra money from subsidies. Subsidies were the sums voted to the king by Parliament. Usually this was done in times of trouble, such as warfare, and was only granted under special circumstances from Parliament. So we've looked at the reign of Richard II, but we never closely looked at his management of finances. Well, we need to therefore consider what customs revenue he might take on, what crown lands he might gain extra money from, and how he was able to extract extra additional money from Parliament. In the final few years of his reign, Richard roughly received around £116,000 in annual income, which is an incredible amount for a medieval king. And it's not surprising really, because if you think about the final few years of Richard's reign, there was relatively little warfare, which would mean that the customs revenue would increase because trade could flourish between the continent and Britain. Secondly, he had given out patronage to people that he particularly felt strongly towards and he could trust, therefore he would receive extra money from his crown lands. And finally, he was very good at milking the final bits of money away from Parliament through threat and intimidation. Yet we also know that Richard's means of trying to get more money from the commons led to his downfall and ultimately the Lancastrian usurpation. Now, when Henry got to the throne, he also realised that he had to control his spending. Otherwise, he could be accused of financial mismanagement, much like his cousin. But unfortunately for Henry, things didn't go the way that he had planned. To be expected, income was to be down from Richard's previous reign of roughly about £103,000, of which £36,000 would be from customs, £35,000 from crown lands, and £32,000 from subsidies. But the actual annual income that Henry received was only about £90,000. So why was this? Well, firstly, and through no fault of Henry, French Civil War disrupted trade between the Low Countries, France, and Britain. So this would have a particular impact on wool and cloth, and as a result, reduce the amount of customs revenue that Henry would receive. Secondly, and something that we'll look at in more depth within the classroom, the commons were unwilling to grant additional subsidies following the gross financial mismanagement in Richard's reign. And finally, income from crown lands was reduced because of the rebellions that took place in the north and in Wales, where there were a number of royal estates. So through a variety of different reasons, Henry had a reduced income. But did he manage to keep his expenditure down? The answer is an easy one, no. Henry IV's expenditure can be seen here in the year 1402. He had to spend £56,000 on the defence of the realm, largely as a result of the Percy rebellions, the beginnings of the Glendower uprising as well. He had to spend £24,000 in annuities and grants to various different noblemen. According to the council, he spent £16,000 on his own private wardrobe. That actually isn't true, it's roughly around £42,000. And then finally, he had to give a service of loans of around £16,000. And the odd one here is that he had to spend £8,000 on returning Queen Isabel to France. So in total, Henry IV spent around £120,000 per year at the start of his year, which grossly exceeded the amount of money that he had as part of his income. So the question that many historians look at was whether this was down to Henry's inadequacies or whether he had to spend an additional amount of money that he didn't have, and therefore be in debt? Well, firstly, Henry had to defend the realm. The wars against the Welsh, the French and the Scots had all put a drain on resources. So the question that the historian needs to ask is, were these as a result of Henry's bellicose actions, or were these defensive actions? You have to remember as well that Henry was a usurper, and any usurper king has to make sure that their reputation is enhanced so they look like a legitimate king. Therefore, Henry had to run a lavish household to live up his name as king. And with that, Henry had to surround himself with a new class of nobility. He had to reward those members of the nobility that had supported him during the usurpation. And as a result, he had to therefore give out an incredible amount of money in patronage. So it could be argued that Henry's hands were tied and he had to give out plenty of money that he actually didn't have. But Henry didn't help himself. He didn't keep any accounts, which meant that households' finances were completely mismanaged. So therefore, up to about 1406, Henry and Parliament were completely at odds with one another. Henry needed to gain more money, and Parliament were unwilling to listen to the demands of the new king. So in class, we're going to look at 3 questions that have been raised from this video. The first is whether Henry was forced into a position of financial mismanagement. The second, how could Henry have improved his financial status, or could he have actually improved his financial status? And finally, a question that we've only really touched on at the end here, is how did the situation resolve itself in the latter half of Henry's reign, between Parliament and the king?